select few of these questions will be answered by our speaker directly during the Q&A session that immediately follows the presentation. Before we begin, allow me to first introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. David Peters, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Cognition at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. Dr. Peters is, without a doubt, quite well-versed in sharing his insights and expertise, as he has frequently been invited to provide talks and keynote speeches in conferences and events across Europe, in North America, and in Africa, mostly on the topics of the neurobiology of language, the use of virtual reality and neurolinguistic studies, and the use of gestures in communication. A brief summary of Dr. Peters' qualifications. Dr. Peters completed his doctoral education in the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, particularly in the Multi-Modal Language and Cognition group. He received his PhD with a thesis titled A Social and Neurobiological Approach to Pointing in Speech and Gesture. Prior to his current tenure at Tilburg University, Dr. Peters had previously conducted research at the bear with me for a minute, Laboratoire de Psychologie Cognitive in Aix-Marseille University in France, hopefully that was right, and was employed for a number of years as a research staff in the Neurobiology of Language department at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen. Throughout his teaching career, Dr. Peters has developed and taught numerous university courses, including those in Foundations of Language and Communication, as well as in virtual, augmented, and mixed reality for the language sciences. He has also given lectures in neurolinguistics, in multimodal language and communication, the neurobiology and genetics of language, and nonverbal communication, in addition to supervising a number of master's and PhD students, as well as postdoctoral fellows. As a prolific researcher, Dr. Peters has conducted an impressive number of studies on the neurobiology of language and communication, many of which involve the use of virtual reality, brain imaging, and electrophysiological measures. He has received research grants from various sources, both within and outside the Netherlands, and he has also authored and co-authored dozens of manuscripts in both English and in Dutch. In the past 3 to 4 years alone, he has had 15 publications in several peer-reviewed scientific journals, including in the journals Language, Cognition, and Neuroscience, the Quarterly Journal of Experimental Psychology, Psychonomic Bulletin and Review, and Behavior Research Methods. As a cognitive neuroscience enthusiast myself, I personally can't wait to listen to Dr. Peters' presentation, and I'm sure all of you feel the same way too. So without further ado, let us welcome Dr. David Peters to begin his presentation titled The Role of Hand Gestures in Language and Communication, a Neurocognitive Perspective. Dr. Peters, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for those very kind words. It's really a great pleasure to be able to meet you today online, to speak with you, and to be a speaker in this very first lecture series. I hope you've been having a great week and also had a great meeting yesterday in the afternoon. And I hope we can make this a very interesting and fun event right before your start of the weekend. Right, so it's a great pleasure to talk to you today about the role of hand gestures in language and communication, and I'll try to present a neurocognitive perspective. And the outlook for today, for this presentation, it looks like this. It consists of 4 main parts. In general, I hope to present a cognitive or neurocognitive perspective on language, and therefore I thought it might be interesting first to briefly talk about what language actually is. And this may seem a very trivial question, but if I ask this question to different colleagues in different departments, typically they all come up with different answers. After that, I hope to focus a bit on hand gestures. And with hand gestures, I mean the hand movements, the gestures we typically mean when we're speaking with each other. Then I'll talk a bit about language as a referential system. And finally, as a sort of final part of the presentation, I thought it would be interesting to finish with a more provocative question. namely, do we listen with our eyes? So we all know that we typically listen with our ears, but could it be the case that perhaps we also a little bit sometimes listen with our eyes? Well, that will be the final part. So let's start with this first part, asking, what is language? If I ask this question to students here at Tilburg University in classes, in courses that I teach, I typically get answers like this. So if I ask this question, what is language? Most students, most people will say, well, language is basically a set of words. So immediately what comes to mind is a dictionary, perhaps. If you look at a dictionary, you find a set of words. If you know all those words, perhaps you know everything you would like to know about the language. Of course, those words consist of sounds, right? We manage to speak out loud those words. And we don't just produce individual words when we're speaking with people, but typically we produce phrases, utterances, sentences. So those words are combined together according to certain combinatorial rules. In languages like English, it's not very common to start a sentence with a verb, for instance. You more often would start a sentence with an article. There's certain rules that we all implicitly know that allow us to combine those different words.
Sorry, Dr. Peters, I think we can't see the transition, you moving your slides. I think you have to, you can either, would you mind trying stopping your sharing screen and then resharing?
I'm so sorry. Let's try this again.
All right. It's all right.
I'll restart it. Thank you for telling me now.
Sorry about that, because I wasn't sure if you were shifting your page or not, but
I will. I'll restart it and then it should work. Okay, here we go again. So now you should see the title. Do you see the second slide now?
No, still not. Perhaps you can try the slideshow presentation. So the bottom right-hand corner, right here, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So if I now click on the slideshow.
Yeah, let's see.
Do you now see it in the slideshow perspective?
No, for some reason, no, we can't.
Okay, so that's where it goes wrong. Sorry, then I'll just maybe present it like this.
Okay, can you try moving to the second slide so we know? Okay, yes, that works. All right.
All right. I'm really sorry for that.
No, it's all right. That's all right. Sorry for interrupting. Go ahead. Please continue.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so here to quickly repeat today's overview. So there will be basically 4 parts, starting with the first question, what is language? And as I said, if you ask different people, typically if you would ask someone what is language, typically they would answer you, it's a set of words consisting of sounds, and we combine those words in different ways via certain combinatorial rules. There's also spoken versus written language, of course. Some people would say in a more philosophical way, perhaps, language is a way to express thoughts. We all have certain thoughts. We manage to express those via words, via the spoken languages that we use. In that sense, it's a system to communicate. So those definitions, those answers to this question, not many people will disagree with this. But you could also say maybe language is much more than this. So perhaps the hand gestures that we make when we're speaking, those are typically gestures that we spontaneously make. We don't really think about this. It just happens that we make those. Maybe those should also be considered part of language. At the same time, in conversations, in face-to-face communication, for instance, there are also facial expressions that we have. Those also come naturally to us. Maybe this part, those kind of signals that we convey should also be considered part of language. Of course, there are spoken and written languages, but you may also know that there are sign languages. For instance, there's a Balinese sign language that you may know that is used in the north part of Bali. These are also often full-fledged languages. So in this case, a deaf community has developed a sign language, a way to communicate via hand gestures, facial expressions. And they manage to communicate in such a rich way that is equally rich as the spoken language that we know. So language is not just perhaps spoken or written or spoken and written, but there are also sign languages. Also the manual and modality can be used to communicate. If you want to go really far, you could say perhaps language is a joint action. So it's something we do together. I might say something, you listen to this and respond to this. We jointly communicate and we jointly manage to sort of settle what we both are talking about or thinking about. So in this way, perhaps language is like an action you perform. You perform together. And of course, there are also intentions. Typically, before we say something, we have a certain intention to convey a message. You could say maybe that's also part of language. So in this way, there are different definitions at different grain sizes. Perhaps language is much more than a set of words just consisting of sounds that we put together in a certain order to communicate. In research on language in general, different researchers have different theoretical backgrounds, and they consider language a different thing depending on their background, the discipline they are in. You could say in some branches of theoretical linguistics, if you ask people what language is, they would come up with this type of answer, which you could call a narrow view on language. And narrow here is not meant in a negative or pejorative sense. It's more looking at language really at its core. If you consider a sentence like the child gave the mother the cat, a typical utterance, this is something you could analyze from a linguistic perspective, and you would see, for instance, that there would be a noun phrase in this sentence and a verb phrase, and all the different words in this sentence have a different verb, noun, or article category to it, certain syntactic role that they play in this utterance. You could see this as being language. This is perhaps the core of language in some disciplines, they say. If you would ask a communication scholar, a communication scientist, what language is, they would probably answer you, well, language has a very important function, namely, it allows us to communicate with each other. If you take a communication course, probably in one of the first classes, you will see a figure like this, where the lecturer will explain to you, language is the means that we use to communicate. There's a certain sender of the message on the one hand that encodes a message, then conveys it. And there's also a receiver on the other hand who decodes the message and tries to understand it. And of course, there's all sorts of noise around, maybe physical noises that in a way make this not a very trivial task. So this decoding and this encoding is not very straightforward, but in most cases, we manage to get our message across. And often, almost always, the receiver more or less understands what the sender is sending. This is really a communication perspective. As you will notice here, here the focus again is really on, you see those heads and those faces. So again, the assumption often is more or less, well, language is speech mainly. You don't see any hands here, for instance. There are no clear facial expressions. In psycholinguistics, which is my background, often a more cognitive, or even now today, a neurocognitive view is presented. And in those disciplines, researchers typically think about what are the mental processes or what are the cognitive processes that allow us to communicate with each other, that allow us to use language. And for instance, you can think of language comprehension. What are the sort of cognitive processes that allow you to understand what I'm trying to say? So for instance, if I would say a sentence like, I took the car for a spin, how does your brain allow you to understand what I'm saying? And there are different theoretical models, for instance, in this field of language comprehension that try to explain how you understand the words that I'm uttering. And if you look at this detailed example sentence, for instance, one relatively old model already says, well, if you hear this word spin, the final word in this sentence, it actually also holds for all the other words in the sentence, then what actually happens is that as a listener, as a comprehender, you make use of your memory. So in your memory, all words that you know are stored. So if you hear the first sound of this word spin, In your memory, certain words become active. Most prominently, the words that start with the sound S, with the S sound. So for instance, soap, but also spinach, and also psychologist, for instance. And then if this word sort of comes in, while this word comes in, and you, for instance, hear the second sound in this word, the sort of selection of words that remain active, that you remain considering, becomes smaller. And if you hear more and more information about this final word, at the end, you select one word from your memory, connected to the meaning of this word that you know, that you have also stored in your memory. And in this way, you sort of select words from your memory in order to understand what I'm saying. So first, there's sort of a short list, relatively long words of candidates that you consider, and you sort of narrow down this selection as more information comes to your ears. So in this way, researchers in psycholinguistics and cognitive science have been really speculating about the mental processes that are going on while you're listening to someone. Same holds for speaking. And then in the end, what the cognitive perspective could look like is typically presented in those kind of models. So don't worry about all the terms that you see here in this model. I'll try to convey to you the basic idea of this framework. So typically researchers with a sort of cognitive perspective come up with sort of a description or depiction of the cognitive processes that take place when people are speaking with each other, when people are listening to speech. As I said, what's very important and what you see in the middle of this graph here is that we have all sorts of knowledge stored in our long-term memory. So in our brains, of course, a lot of information that we have acquired over a lifetime of experience is stored in our brains in long-term memory. And in the case of spoken language, this holds, for instance, for phonetic information or phonological information. So we know sort of what kind of sounds we know ourselves and we can encounter in our everyday communication. We also have lexical knowledge, so the words are stored in our memory. Syntactic knowledge. So for instance, we implicitly know that some words are, for instance, nouns, others are verbs, and we have sort of stored the meaning of the different words in our long-term memory. And on the basis of this sort of central part of knowledge that is stored in our long-term memory, we both manage to comprehend language, that is depicted here at the left side of this graph. And we also manage to produce language. That's more or less visually depicted on the right side of this graph. So if you look at the left part, if you're now listening to a speaker like myself, you encounter a certain signal, you hear a certain spoken signal right now. And in this case, there are also some visual information because you also partially see me. So those signals first need to be recognized. This can happen first at the level of individual sounds that you hear. And you then put those sounds together to recognize individual words. And then you combine the different words together towards the sentence. So you parse the different words to understand full utterances or sentences. On the production side, in the case of language production, when you produce speech yourself, it goes a bit in the other direction. So you don't start from a signal, but you start from the message level or an intention that you have. You come up with a certain structure without you actually even realizing this. You place the correct words in the correct order and you articulate them. So in general, this is really a cognitive view on language production, on language comprehension. And in both cases, production and comprehension, we make use of the knowledge that we have in long-term memory. And this is typically, those different processes are typically studied in cognitive views, cognitive approaches to language and communication. You can take this even more broadly. So those typical studies, those typical approaches I was just talking about, those cognitive approaches, for a very long time, they just focused on language as a series of words. Whereas, as we talked about before, perhaps there's a bit more to language. Perhaps it's not just words, perhaps it's also facial expressions. So if you're listening to me and looking at me at the same time, there's not just information in what you hear, but perhaps I also convey some information via my hands, via my face. So perhaps a broader view on language is that we could call it a multimodal joint action. So it's multimodal, different modalities take part in it. There's the visual modality, the facial information, the hand gestures, that's visual, right? Well, at the same time, there's auditory information, so the spoken words that we know. And the second part of this definition is this joint action. So if you look at this picture here, there are two people here, and one is actually pointing at something in the distance. And typically what happens, as you know, if you point at something, the other person will try to look at what you're pointing at. And you could say this is something that's very joint. So do we really do this together? So one person is pointing, the other person follows the pointing gesture of the person, tries to see what that person is pointing at. So it's really an action, it's really something we do together. If I point at something and you don't immediately notice what I'm pointing at, I could maybe give you a bit more information. I could tell from your response that maybe you don't know what I'm talking about. So jointly, we sort of manage to achieve what we are talking about. So this is really another way of looking at language. It's more of an action. It might be related to all sorts of actions that we perform in everyday life. Here you see a nice background picture of Tilburg University, actually. If you think of language in this way, it's really a means that allows us to have face-to-face communication. And you could argue this is actually the cornerstone of language, of communication. What do we have language for? Well, basically, we have language, fortunately, such that it allows us to have face-to-face communication. And in those very core situations, everyday situations in which we use language most, there's almost always more than just speech. There's also this facial information, the gestures. So perhaps the basic situations in which we use language are multimodal in nature. So perhaps we should, as a starting point, take language to be a face-to-face multimodal phenomenon and also study it in that way. Here's another situation, and those typical everyday situations in which we use language are typically very rich and dynamic, communicative, take place in 3D. There's auditory information, visual information. So it's really a multimodal phenomenon. So maybe also in the cognitive and neurocognitive sciences, we should study language as really this multimodal phenomenon and not just only focus on words. And in a recent paper by Judith Haller and Stephen Levinson, they also say this should be the approach we should be taking in the cognitive sciences and neurocognitive sciences. So they say the natural ecology of human language, so the situation in which we use language most, situations for which language was evolving, is face-to-face interaction. And it's not just that we exchange spoken signals, but we typically exchange all sorts of multimodal signals. Facial signals, signals via the hands, via body posture, at the same time communicating via words. And all this takes place at the very same time. So it's more than just a spoken way of communicating. So if you then think of this model in communication sciences, perhaps it should be updated a bit and look like this. So rather than just presenting two faces in a very abstract way, we should look at language and communication like this. So the sender sends also the signals at the same time. The receiver receives also the signals at the same time and needs to combine and segment all those signals at the same time to arrive at the message that the sender is trying to convey. So it's more than just spoken signals. And then if you think of this more cognitive view, maybe we should not just look at comprehending and producing spoken words, spoken signals, but there might be way more going on. So there are also the signals coming in, not just auditory, but also visual. We need to segment all those different types of signals and then combine them, integrate them again to understand what someone is conveying. On the other side, if you think of language production, we should come up with some kind of cognitive model that explains how we, at the same time, manage to convey spoken words, hand gestures, facial expressions via speech, but also via the face, via the hands, via the body. So also a cognitive view perhaps should be expanded to include all those things because they're so central to what language actually is. If you then take it one step further and look at not just a cognitive view, but a neurocognitive view, then you arrive in the field of neuroscientists, neurobiology of language. What they are typically interested in, very broadly, is understanding really how our brain, how the biological organ that we have in our heads allows us to understand and produce language. They really take a neurocognitive view and ask questions like, then what kind of brain structures, what parts of the brain, what connections between networks of parts of the brain allow us then to communicate. And for a long time, they've been trying to map all those cognitive processes that we know from the more cognitive approach to parts of the brain. So here's a relatively influential and also very accessible model of how this would work. Here you see an image of the brain. So you're looking at the left side of a brain, and the nose is more or less towards the left side, and the right side of this image, that's the back of someone's brain. And here, 3 different cognitive processes or functions are distinguished, namely memory, unification, and control. And those are then coupled to different parts of the brain. So the yellow part here is linked to memory. This is a part of the temporal lobe. And the idea is much of the knowledge that we have of different words is stored in this part of the brain. Not just on the left side, but the same, more or less the same on the right side of the brain. Then there's a bluish part that would be involved in the process of unification, as it is called here. This really means combining different types of information. So combining different types of signals, visual and auditory signals, but also combining different words. If you're listening to more than one word at a time, the idea is that this part of your brain becomes involved and combines the different types of information such that you not just understand individual words, but also all words together. And then here there's another region marked in more or less purple, pink kind of color, and that will be involved in control processes. So if you're speaking, at the same time, you're sort of monitoring the things you're saying yourself to make sure you keep expressing yourself correctly. If you know several different languages, it's important that you continue speaking in the right language, in the right context. So my mother tongue is Dutch, but it's probably a good thing if I continue speaking in English today, such that you will understand me. The idea is that there are also some control processes that try to monitor whether speaking, for instance, is still, this task is still performed in the correct way. So the idea is, in this neurocognitive view, what kind of brain structures and networks make it possible for us to communicate with each other. So this is really more a neural perspective. Right, so those were different perspectives on the question, what is language? The cognitive view mainly focuses on the kind of mental cognitive processes that are going on in our minds when we manage to communicate with each other. A neural view really more specifically looks at different brain parts, different structures, how do they work together, which parts of the brain are important. And importantly, different people will give you a different answer to the question, what is language? Right, let's now focus a bit more on hand gestures then. So as you may know, there are different types of hand gestures that we make when we're communicating with each other. Those can be classified into different categories. There are so-called iconic gestures. They typically resemble in their form what they mean. So here in this image, you see a drinking gesture, right? So this hand movement, its form really resembles its meaning of drinking. So in that sense, they're often very easy to recognize because you recognize them more or less intuitively because they are iconic in that sense. Then there are so-called emblems. Those are very similar actually to spoken words in that they typically have a conventionalized meaning. And in different cultures, the same emblem, the same gesture could mean different things. Here you, for instance, see the American sign for okay, everything's okay. It's sort of a convention that in certain societies, we know what this gesture basically means. We sort of implicitly negotiated what it means, and we sort of all know what this form that you see actually means. A bit similar to a spoken word, right? We all sort of, if you think of the word tree, we all sort of agree what it means. Then there are beat gestures, which are very frequently employed by politicians. So next time you see a politician on TV, for instance, try to look at their hand gestures. Those are typically up and down movements of the hand that are used to emphasize important parts of speech. And they don't have a really iconic meaning in themselves. They typically highlight important parts of speech, and they're very much aligned with the stress that people produce, the stress patterns in their spoken utterance. And then there are pointing gestures that you will all know that are used to draw someone's attention to something, typically. Let's talk a bit more about those pointing gestures. So they seem very easy and very straightforward. But I think there's some interesting things to them, especially also if you keep this bigger question in your mind. What is language? How should we perceive of language? Pointing gesture is typically defined as a communicative body movement that projects a vector, so a sort of line, from a body part, typically the index finger, and it indicates a certain direction or a location or an object. So for instance, if someone asks you where's the closest train station, you may point at it in a certain direction, or perhaps you see the train station, so you point at a certain object. Typically, as far as we know, in all cultures that have been studied in this respect, it turns out to be the case that people do this with their index finger, even though they're also using all sorts of other body parts, typically to point. So often also the whole hand is used to point at something. Sometimes in certain societies, if you point at something that's behind you, you may point with your thumb. People point with their head, with their eyes. So if you don't really want to notice that someone's pointing, that you're pointing at something, you would secretly just point with your eyes at something. Sometimes in certain cultures, people point with their lips or even with their chin or their nose. And there might be other manual body parts that are, for instance, used, such as your little finger. If you hold something in your hand, you don't have your index finger available. And sometimes people have something in their hands and they're sitting. They might even point at something with their leg. So it's more than just the index finger. And it's really, you could say, a basic, very basic component of our linguistic skills. So it's ubiquitous. So we're pointing at things all the time. It's argued to be uniquely human. Although in captivity, certain other animals have also been trained to be able to point. And then, for instance, chimpanzees at some point can also learn to point at different things. It's primordial in ontogeny, which basically means that almost often infants, young babies start pointing before they start using speech, really to draw attention to something in their vicinity and to sort of establish what they're jointly communicating about. And it can also create further types of signs. So you can imagine you point at something with your index finger and at the same time sort of indicate by another little movement what you're pointing at looks what your referent thing you're pointing at looks like. So for instance, if you see somebody running by, you want to point at that person, you can sort of make a little moving or running or walking movement with your pointing gesture. So it's really the basis for more signs. Right. What's, I think, a very strong argument for looking at language as more than just spoken words is that those pointing gestures that we produce are often coupled with words that are so-called demonstratives. So in English, you have the words this and that. So you could point at something and say, this object over there, or that object over there, or this object right here. What's interesting here is that different languages have different numbers of those terms. So in English, there are 2 terms. In the singular case, this and that. But in Turkish, for instance, there are 3 different terms. And in other languages, there are even 6 terms or more. So like pointing gestures, those demonstrative words appear very early during development. At very early stages of infants' lives, typically when they start producing their first words, those are very often among the top 10 of words that they've produced for the first time in their life. They're found in all spoken languages. They're etymologically very old. It's really hard to trace them back to older words, and they're very frequent, like pointing gestures. Now, if you think of a more or less narrow view of language, such as this more syntactic analysis of an utterance, of course, those hand gestures are not in focus here. They're not mentioned. They're actually ignored. So if you think of those pointing gestures and those demonstratives as things that are typically occurring together, it seems very artificial to completely ignore the gestural part of language and just focus on the words. In certain cultures, it's even obligatory to point at something when you use a certain demonstrative. So they cannot be used separately. So in that sense, you would say it might not make too much sense to just look at language from the spoken perspective. If you ignore the visual part, the gestural part, you're really missing out on something. So therefore, in more and more recent approaches, spoken words and hand gestures are no longer really treated as really different things. The idea is those are such basic elements of our everyday communication. They should be studied together. And if you're studying spoken language, you cannot ignore those hand gestures, because, for instance, in this case of pointing gestures and demonstrative, they are so tied together. It just doesn't make sense to only analyze and investigate the spoken part. One should not ignore also the visual signals that are present at the very same time. All right, that was very briefly a focus on hand gestures. There are different types of hand gestures. They're really connected to the spoken signals that we produce, and it's very hard to sort of look at them separately. Let me then tell you something about language as a referential system as a third part of this lecture, to once again perhaps illustrate this cognitive perspective of looking towards language. Maybe this is also a good moment to illustrate this cognitive perspective and say that, as you may have noticed by now, this kind of research that we are doing and those kind of theories that we're building, those kind of cognitive models, they are really so-called curiosity-driven. So this type of research typically starts with a question that you may have as a researcher. So you may just wonder, you may just be curious. If you think, for instance, of those pointing gestures and those demonstratives, how do people use them? When do they use one type of demonstrative? When do they use another type of demonstrative? So those questions are really driven by a certain curiosity. It's not the case that they are driven by, for instance, a societal problem that you want to solve, or a practical question that you may have as a researcher. So really the focus is mostly theoretical. And the idea is, if we study those different phenomena, we may manage to understand our language and communication capacities better. If at some point there are some practical benefits of this research, or societal benefits of this research, then that's very nice, of course. But really the focus point is advancing our knowledge. Just because as a researcher, you're sort of curious, how do those things work? Not necessarily because it starts from some kind of practical or societal problem. You really start from the theory and have a certain fundamental question, and you're just curious to find out what the answer might be. That's also very much the case for this research on demonstratives. So those spatial demonstratives, words like this and that. And here's a little experiment. If you would ask something, so just someone who you would encounter in the streets or on campus or anywhere, you could ask them, when do you choose actually the word this? And when do you choose the word that while you're pointing? So if I ask this question to people, there are typically two components to their answer. And the first component is what you could call the distance hypothesis. So most people, if you ask them, would say something like, the only thing that matters is the distance of a certain object or location or referent to the speaker. So if something is really far away, maybe I will say that object over there. And if something is relatively close to myself, I would say this object over here, right? So we have those, in English, we have those two different demonstrative terms, this and that. We would use this for things relatively close by and that for things relatively far away. Other researchers have then investigated this, and they say things like, well, there's more than distance, actually. There's more than just distance. It's also perhaps important if something is visible. Perhaps if something is visible, you may be more inclined to say this object. If something is invisible, you may be more inclined to say that object. Perhaps ownership is another variable that might play a role here, next to visibility and distance or location. If you own something yourself, you might perhaps be more inclined to say this object. If you don't own something yourself, you may be more inclined to say that object. So perhaps there are different kind of factors that play a role. And some researchers even have said physical distance is not so important. Perhaps it's more psychological distance. So if something is, let's say, close to your heart, so psychologically it may be close to you, perhaps then you would be more inclined to use this. And if something is psychologically sort of feels like far away to you, even though perhaps physically it's close, perhaps then you would choose that. So it could be the case that we're talking about something that's really close to our heart, but we're physically far away, and then still say something like this object. Even though perhaps something is physically really close to us, but we don't really like it, perhaps then you would say still that object, even though it's physically really close. Another component to this, to the answer to this question is, if you say, I use this for things that are close, those people you might ask this question would typically say, we use this for things that are close to me. If something is close to me, I will say this. If something is far away to me, I would say that. That's one hypothesis in those cases. Other researchers have said, well, some demonstratives may indeed be egocentric, but others may be more sociocentric. So as a speaker and a listener, or as two speakers in a conversation, we typically decide together whether something is close to us or not, psychologically. And some of those demonstrative terms may be sensitive to this. So if something is psychologically close to the both of us because we both like it, or because we've just been talking about this very one thing for 10 minutes or so, we might say this, even though perhaps physically it's not really close. And then some other researchers have said, well, basically for all demonstrative, this holds. If something is psychologically close to us in English, you would say this. If it's psychologically far away to the both of us, you would say that object. And those are hypotheses and theories we're also investigating. So here on the right, you see a colleague, Amalia Skilton, who went to the Amazon jungle to study a language community there who speak the language Tikuna. And she tried to find out, how do those people who use this language use those different demonstratives that they have. And we do little experiments there, asking those speakers to refer to different things. And we just look at what kind of terms they use. And then as a consequence of those kind of experiments that you can do in all sorts of different language communities, again, we come up with so-called cognitive models. So here, yeah, please ignore what's written here in those different boxes. But the idea is there are all sorts of cognitive processes that play a role when you're using a demonstrative as a speaker. And there may be some physical variables. For instance, something is close by physically or not. There may be some psychological variables that play a role, whether it's something is already in our joint attention or not. And there may be some variables related to the thing that you're referring to, such as whether it's animate or inanimate, whether it's tall, large, or whether it's small. And all those different variables are sort of combined and weighted in a certain cognitive process. And based on this process, you may pick one demonstrative in your spoken utterance or another. So a cognitive view on language as a joint action typically then presents those kind of boxes and arrow models that try to describe or even explain how people use language. And as I said at the start of this third part of the lecture, these questions are really curiosity driven, right? There's no societal problem around demonstratives. There's no practical problem that we try to solve. We as researchers in the cognitive sciences, in this case, for instance, we're really just interested in how does this work? We apparently notice that there are different of those terms of those demonstratives. There are two in English, for instance, not just one. And then the question is, why would there be two? Why would people sometimes use the one, use the other? We try to study this, for instance, in experiments, and try to come up with some kind of theoretical framework or model to explain how this works. Perhaps at some point, this may lead to some practical solutions to problems or to a societal, maybe at some point it may have societal benefits. For instance, there might be patients who, because of a stroke or so, have problems referring to different things. Then as a starting point, it's sort of nice to know that we already have a model of how this typically works at a cognitive level, such that if people start having problems with referring to things or using speech or producing speech, we can sort of compare this to the behavior that we've previously studied in healthy behavior in healthy participants, and compare this and try to predict how we can perhaps help those patients. But this is not the starting point of the research. The starting point is really curiosity driven. How would this work in people's minds? Why are there those different terms? What is language? Is it just speech or more? And then if you study a phenomenon like those demonstratives that are very often used concurrently with a pointing gesture, this might be a theoretical basis for understanding language and communication better. Right, we have arrived at the fourth and final part of this presentation. Yeah, it's also right before the weekend. It might be nice to end with at least this part of the presentation, end with a more provocative question, which is, do we listen with our eyes? And I'll try to convince you that we listen also with our eyes. So if you're a student, or if you have ever studied psychology, you will most likely be familiar with the so-called Mcgurk Effect. The Mercuric Effect was reported in 1976, actually by two authors, Mcgurk and MacDonald. But basically, everybody typically forgets about the second author, MacDonald, because it's simply called the Mcgurk Effect. The idea is, you as a participant are invited to a research lab. Imagine that's the case, and you're placed in front of a computer screen. Typically in a laboratory, in a quiet room, you're placed in front of a computer screen, and you're going to watch videos of a speaker's face. And if you Google this term, for instance, on YouTube, you will find all sorts of examples, and you can try it out for yourself. And in this experiment, participants were tricked. So they were shown video clips of a speaker's face who would be producing individual syllables. And what was the case in those videos is that there was certain information conveyed via the lips of this person in the video. And for instance, the lip movements of this person in the video could correspond to the syllable ga. So if you produce the syllable ga, your lips have a certain movement, they have a certain shape. You can record someone who produces the syllable ga, and then their lips will have a certain movement, a certain shape. Now, what those two researchers did, secretly more or less, is that then they combined those lip movements of someone who produced the syllable ga, they took away the sound, and then they replaced this sound with the sound of the syllable ba. So they merged those two different streams of information. So the lip movements would still correspond to the syllable ga, but the sound that was presented corresponded to the syllable ba. So this was sort of a mismatch between the lip movements and the sound that was presented to people. And then the question they had was, if you now ask people who watch this video and who do not know about this manipulation, will they actually report that they hear the syllable ga, or will they report that they hear the syllable ba? If they report that they hear the syllable ga, then apparently we really very strongly rely on people's visual signals, on their lip movements when they are speaking, when we are listening to them. If those participants in this experiment report that they hear the sound ba, then apparently they really very strongly make use of the spoken signal that they hear. If you would do this experiment with your eyes closed, of course, everybody would hear ba, because there's just auditory information. But they asked people to look at this video. They had manipulated in this sort of secret way, and they were just curious about what people would hear. Now, actually, what was kind of surprising, what came out of this study, is that participants didn't say that they heard ga, but they also didn't say that they heard ba. Rather, they reported that they heard something different, which was da in this case. I think that's it's a very classic finding, also a very interesting finding, because actually what seems to happen here is that if you think of the different sounds here, this ga sound really comes from the back of your mouth, from the back of your oral cavity. It's really in the back, produced this onset of this syllable. It's really coming from the back of your mouth, whereas ba is really produced via movement of the lips, right? Ba. So if you make the sound yourself, it's really the front part of your mouth is really important. Now, what's interesting about this da sound, so what people reported that they heard, it's sort of in between. So it doesn't really come from the back of your mouth. It also doesn't really come from the front of your mouth. It's sort of in between. If you produce it yourself, that sort of in between the front and the back. So apparently what has happened here is that those participants in this study, they must have combined those two different types of information. So they must have perceived the lip movements, and at the same time, they must have perceived the spoken signal, and they combined those two types of information to sort of make a best guess of what they were hearing. And apparently that was somewhere in between. So their brain told them, what you actually hear is sort of in between ga and ba. It took the visual information, it took the auditory information, combined it. And if you combine those two, apparently you end up somewhere in between ba and ga. So already this is more or less a first answer to the question, do we listen with our eyes? So the answer there, preliminary, based on this research, is yes. We listen with our ears, partially, but at the same time, we listen with our eyes, if you will. And those two streams of information are combined to sort of make a guess of what you're hearing. So actually, also in this case, you don't actually hear what is produced, but you sort of hear something different because this visual information is also taken into account. In a recent study with a colleague, Hans-Rutger Bosker, we said, well, it's now almost 50 years ago that this study was done. It was a very influential study. Might it be the case that not just lip movements are visual signals that are important when we listen to people? Might it be the case that also hand gestures are important when we listen to people? And we specifically focus on those so-called beach gestures. And since we're not in presentation mode, let me see if I can give you an example of those beach gestures like this. Let's see if this works. Oh, no, it doesn't work. So let me then maybe show you myself. That will work anyway. So what's specific about those beach gestures is that they are typically produced, as I said before, in line with the stress pattern of the spoken signals that you're conveying. So as I said, also politicians are typically very much trained to use those beach gestures. And you can think of situations, so I'll try to imitate this. If I say something like, now I say this, you notice that at certain words, there's a certain stress on the words, right? And typically what people spontaneously do and what politicians do also a bit more if they're trained to do so, is produce those beat gestures at the very same moment where there's stress, or there's a peak in stress in their spoken signals that they're conveying. So in this recent study, we thought, well, maybe like those lip movements, also those beat gestures might play a role in actually influencing what people hear. So we set out to test this, and we called this a quest for the manual Mcgurk effect. So the traditional effect is the Mcgurk effect, right? It looks at the role of lip movements in auditory speech recognition. We call it a manual Mcgurk effect to see whether those beat gestures also play the role. So like in the original study almost 50 years ago, we invited participants to a research lab. We placed them in front of a computer screen and we showed them videos. And in this case, we presented them not with individual syllables, but we presented them with individual words. And those words were always part of a word pair. So for instance, in English, you can think of the word pair permit and permit. So the idea of this word pair is that those two words, they of course have a different meaning, right? But the sounds that together form this word are exactly the same. So they consist of the same phoneme units. The only difference between those two words, permit and permit, is that the stress pattern is different. So in the first case, the stress is on the first syllable. In the second case, the stress is on the second syllable. So if you listen to the individual sounds, they're the same, but really the stress pattern is different. What we then did in a very experimental, I think a very cognitive approach to language research is that we recorded those words. We had a speaker produce the word permit, and then a bit later we asked the same speaker to produce the word permit, and we made sure they were equally long, and we made sure that the phonemes were all the same, but the only difference between the two words was the stress. So in the first case, there was stress on the first syllable. In the second case, there was stress on the second syllable. And then we presented participants with sentences and a video at the same time. of a speaker saying a sentence like a very abstract sentence like, now I say the word permit, or now I say the word permit. And we ask people very simply, what do you hear? Do you hear permit or do you hear permit? If you do this task without presenting any visual information, then it's relatively easy. And if people hear permit, say, I hear permit. And if they hear, if they're presented with permit, they say, I hear permit. So that's sort of the baseline. And what we then did is we started manipulating those words, permit and permit, in a technical way using speech software, such that we created a continuum of different words from permit to permit, with words that was sort of in between. So if you listen to them with your eyes closed, it's very hard to tell. Is it permit? Is it permit? It's sort of in between. You can't really tell. So then we included also those words in the experiment. And importantly, while participants in this manual Mcgurk task were in the lab and they were sitting in front of a computer screen, we also presented them with videos of a speaker. So here is the first author of this work, Hans Rutger Bosker, who we recorded. And he was recorded like this. Participants heard this sentence. Now I say the word permit or permit. And we here also did this in an experiment with non-existing words. So there would be Demrov, Demrov, and also some words sort of in between with no really clear stress pattern. And what's important here is that our speaker here in the videos would also make beat gestures. And those beat gestures could be paired with the first syllable or with the second syllable. So you could hear a word like permit with a beat gesture on the first syllable, and a word like permit with a beat gesture on the second syllable, but also the other way around. So there could also be this more or less this mismatch, right? So you would hear permit with stress on the first syllable, but the beat gesture would come with the second syllable. I hope you're still with me. This is a very typical psychological task, an experimental design with different conditions. Most importantly, the task here was for participants. What do you hear? What's the last word? Do you hear permit or do you hear permit? And they simply pressed buttons saying, oh, here I hear permit, here I hear permit. And we asked them, yeah, what do you hear? If you want to try this out yourself, there's a link on the slides. Feel free to go there. If you don't have access to the slides, then you may search at the Open Science Framework for this project, looking for my name or look for beat gestures. Or if you get access to the slide, please click on the link. And you can try it for yourself what this experiment looked like and see whether you sort of also are sensitive to this manual Mercuric effect. Because actually what we found is that if we ask people, do you hear permit or permit? They are very much influenced by the presence of this beat gesture. So if the word, for instance, is really in between permit and permit, and you cannot really tell, if the beat gesture is then on the first syllable, they say, I hear permit. If the beat gesture is on the second syllable, they say, I hear permit, even though the word itself was exactly the same and didn't differ. So apparently, not just those lip movements influence what we hear, also those beat gestures influence what we hear. So actually, we sometimes may hear something that's different from what's actually coming from the mouth of the person we're listening to, because we're sort of fooled by this beat gesture. We're so used to beat gestures being placed on stressed syllables that if we see it on a syllable that's maybe not really stressed, we still perceive that syllable as if it is stressed. So therefore, we concluded that there is also such a manual Mcgurk effect. There's a traditional auditory Mcgurk effect, but also a manual Mcgurk effect. And then this was a very artificial study, right? Just pressing one of two buttons. What kind of word did you hear? We replicated this experiment in 3 or 4 different ways, and we constantly found the same thing. Yeah, so if you're interested in those other experiments, you can look them up in this paper. All right, then to conclude, those were the 4 main parts of today's presentation. We first looked at what is language. I tried to convince you, I don't know whether that was necessary to start with, that language is more than just spoken words. So when we're using language, we typically use language in face-to-face situations. That's what language evolves for. That's why we most use language. is more than just spoken words. There's also hand gestures, there's facial expressions. We use our body to communicate. Those hand gestures then take different types. There are different types of those hand gestures. Iconic gestures, we talked a bit about pointing gestures more into detail, and also beat gestures later on. And if you look at language as a referential system, as a tool that we have to refer to the things around us in the world, then immediately it becomes very clear that language is much more than spoken words. So for instance, there are those demonstrative words that are almost always coupled with a pointing gesture if we want to refer to something in the world. So it seems a bit artificial to look at language as just a verbal spoken part. This verbal and this non-verbal part are so intricately related. They can only be looked at together as a starting point. And then finally, we looked at the question, do we listen with our eyes? And the answer seems to be yes. We not only seem to listen with our ears, but also with our eyes. Yeah, so in general, this was, I hope, a more or less cognitive and sometimes also neurocognitive approach to language that is curiosity-driven, looking for answers, typically just for answers to questions that we might have, just because as researchers, we're curious to find out how does this work. And then if we notice, if we come up with cognitive theories and neurocognitive theories, then later on, perhaps this can be taken as a basis to look at more societal and practical issues. Yeah, and then finally, the last thing that that's on my list with regards to the presentation is to thank you very much for your attendance today, for bearing with me for almost an hour. And once again, thanks a lot for the perfect organization. I'm very delighted that we can manage, despite the difficult situation of the world, to have those kind of meetings and yeah, hopefully be inspired to learn from each other and discuss those issues in the language sciences. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peters, for having so kindly shared your knowledge with us. That was, I personally found that very interesting. So we'll move on to the next session, if it's okay with you. Now, we're going to open the forum for a question and answer. Now, but before we start, I would like to ask you, would you like me to help you select the questions, or would you prefer to look at the chat box yourself and go through the questions? There are several questions, and there's also one question. Perhaps I can offer you this first question first, because the person who asked this question actually direct messaged me instead of asked the question in the forum. So if you can answer this first question, and then after that, we can arrange how you would like to go about doing this. We can either, I can either pick for you, or you can just read on your own and select the ones that you find most intriguing to answer. So the first question that went to my direct message was, what is your opinion on cognitive overload? It's in real life situations. Of course, it's enjoyable to listen to your presentation about hand gestures, but in a real life situation, wouldn't this actually cause exhaustion in the information receiver, because we're processing multiple? I guess what the person asking is trying to ask is, we're listening to the speech, we're also looking at the hand gestures, we're also trying to decipher the bodily posture. So would this result in a cognitive overload? I guess that's what the questioner is trying to ask.
Yeah, I think that's a great question to start with. Yeah, it's an excellent question. So of course, intuitively, you would say, if there's information that comes to you in one modality, cognitively, that might be easier than, for instance, when there are two or maybe even three modalities at the same time, because you could just focus on one thing and there wouldn't be anything else. So perhaps that's easier. So if you look at research that really speculates about language evolution, then what's a relatively prominent approach there is to say language, to some extent, was always already perhaps multimodal. So centuries ago, there was, when people used languages, it was almost exclusively in face-to-face situations. So whenever there were spoken signals, there were also visual signals. So if you start from the starting point that language perhaps originally has always been, or for a very long time has been, multimodal, then perhaps the unimodal situation is more or less the exception. Of course, things like reading, also evolutionarily, are a relatively recent invention. For a long time, there were no scripts. Whereas before that, there was already multimodal communication using visual and auditory signals at the same time. So perhaps the multimodal situation is sort of the starting point, and then later on things like writing systems started to develop, and that may have become more sort of unimodal spin-offs of what was already there. Nevertheless, you could still argue, well, it could then still be more taxing to have information coming at you from all sorts of modalities at the same time, and especially if you think of multimedia, also in children, if they're using certain apps or even those virtual reality environments where you get all sorts of information, we also indeed notice that this is very taxing. Nevertheless, even though it may be more taxing, it might be worth it anyway because there are benefits to it. So for instance, if you're speaking with someone on the phone, it might happen more often that you don't really understand each other because there's just information in one modality. Whereas if you're face-to-face, you hear the same information, but also see a facial expression or a hand gesture. There is indeed more information from different channels, but the chances are higher that you then actually understand what the person you're communicating with is trying to convey. So maybe it's a bit more taxing, but it may also have certain benefits why it's worth to invest this extra effort to combine all those different signals.
Thank you very much. So I hope that answered your question, Ms. Nofita. And I think this is actually, if you look in the chat box, I don't know if you can see it, but in the chat box, there's actually a question that's closely related to the one that you just answered. So Marvel was asking, Ms. Marvel Anika was asking she was addressing the person was addressing how to overcome the barriers of online communication, I guess. An undergraduate freshman, she's an undergraduate freshman, and socializing and communicating in an entirely online setting is, of course, dramatically different from what we're used to. And aside from the occasional calls and the occasional Zooms, texting, especially, she said, has an absence of the aforementioned multimodal language expressions that you were talking about. So the Marvel was asking, how can an individual maximize using languages to communicate with these limitations? Is there a way for the brain to adapt, perhaps by finding subtle cues and like hearing tones from text alone? Because I think we've all experienced that, right? Being misunderstood from texts, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, another great question. What I think is very interesting about texting and also maybe emails or so is that, of course, written language is very prominent in those means. But if you look at what people do in practice very often, if they feel like it's allowed, is that they start adding all those types of visual information still to their text messages or to their emails, like those emoticons and those smileys. So for me, this is sort of a sign that people indeed miss something when they're texting. So they might miss the opportunities that they have in face-to-face communication to use more than just words. And they try to sort of replace this by, for instance, smileys and those emoticons, also in emails. So here at university, for instance, in the Netherlands, is typically a bit sort of not done. It doesn't look really good if you, for instance, in formal emails, add a smiley or so. Especially professors, some professors might be like, wow, it doesn't look maybe very professional, it's a bit impolite even. Whereas I typically encourage students to do this because as we know from face-to-face communication, there's more than just words. And why not also in text messages or emails, just exploit the opportunity that we have there to add a bit more than just the spoken or written words. If you think of other parts beyond texting, like those Zoom interactions, there also we typically notice, I think, that this is a bit more fatiguing, right, than a face-to-face communication situation that we might have. Like a typical lecture in a classroom, I guess we never really realized before the pandemic, seems to be a bit less effortful to understand and to communicate than when we're doing this via Zoom. And that might also be caused by the prominence of just one part of the body in those kind of Zoom calls. So perhaps there are some signals that are not really coming through because there's just focus on mostly the face. So I'm not really giving the right example here, but for instance, you could think of online teaching. It might be worth to get a microphone and step a bit from your camera such that you can convey more signals.
Right. Yeah.
And maybe one more thing, if I'm allowed. Of course, now we're again talking perhaps a bit about practical consequences of this more curiosity-driven research. Of course, especially here in Europe, we weren't very used to, for instance, wearing mouth masks in everyday life. And now with the pandemic, this has become something very common. And what we noticed there is that when people are communicating while they're wearing those facial masks, also part of the signal sort of is lost because you no longer see those lip movements. Typically, it's harder to see someone's facial expression. And then we noticed that then people typically start making more of those hand gestures to compensate for this. So I think that's accidentally sort of was a sign that this kind of fundamental curiosity-driven research into the cognition of language and hand gestures, then it's nice to have this knowledge when something like this, a societal issue, a practical issue comes up, because then we have this basic knowledge and can try to explain what then happens, and could even give some tips, like for instance, for teaching or communication across facial, when people are wearing those facial masks.
All right, thank you very much. So that hopefully answered Marvel's question, but she did ask, is there a way for the brain to adapt? What do you think, based on your knowledge, what do you think the answer to this is?
I think for many things, if you just get more and more experience, your brain will adapt to it.
Right, neuroplasticity, right? The main
Exactly.
rule of language. Yeah, but not just language, but learning and cognition in general. So yes, I guess I agree with you, and I think it would be interesting to see if we can adapt eventually, because it's only been 2 years. I don't think it would become apparent immediately, but I think it would be interesting to see if people do adapt to this, like lack of being able to read people's mouths, right? Especially with me, a lot of, I don't know if it's the case with you too in the Netherlands, but here a lot of students actually turn off their cameras during Zoom class. So it's like, it feels like I'm talking to a wall sometimes. So I can't really see if they're understanding, if they're getting my point or not. But yes, I do agree with you that perhaps I can stand up and just carry my mic back there and start to like making gestures just to emphasize the point. So thank you very much for that answer. There's another question. Would you like to read it yourself, or would you like me to read it for you to summarize it?
Yeah, I think this works right. So please, if you don't
mind. Okay, so there's another question from Pita. She's, I think this question is perhaps a highly culture specific question, because in a lot of cultures, especially in Asian cultures, we are not supposed to talk to the elderlies in certain tones and not to use certain words. So the question was, how do you talk to older people to convey what we want without offending them, but being firm enough to convey what we want to say? Because using firm words would often, again, offend them. But without using firm words, they might not be able to understand what it is exactly that we want. Do you have any tips or any suggestions on that?
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, as sort of an outsider, I would definitely, to start with, always stick to the cultural conventions, because I think if you don't do that, maybe you will definitely risk that your message won't come across at all, because rather than focusing on the content, the focus would be so much on the form of your message that might be not appropriate in a certain situation, that even though in your words you might have become more explicit and more clear, perhaps even, it might not come across because you're no longer taken seriously. It also reminds me a bit of those pointing gestures, of course. There's also a nice a paradox or a contradiction there, in that if you look at infants at the start of their lives, typically around when they're 10 months old or so, they start pointing at different things. Whereas in many different cultures, and you might be more familiar with this than myself, it at some point becomes very impolite to point at things in general, or to point at people.
Exactly.
And that might be, I think there's another cultural convention such that I think pointing is very useful and very helpful in everyday communication, because it really allows us to make sure that we're talking about the same thing and that you know what I'm referring to. Whereas there might be a cultural convention that sort of prevents you to use this behavior,
Exactly.
even though as an infant, it may have come to you very naturally. So there, I think the same thing holds. So there might be, if everything was culturally allowed, there might be tools that you could use to establish what you're talking about, to share common ground, to build up what you're jointly communicating about. But it cannot be used because of cultural conventions. And there again, I think it's a much better idea to stick to the cultural conventions, just to not reduce this common ground that you may establish from the start.
All right, thank you very much. You brought up a good point that the pointing gesture, it's primal in that even infants use it. But I don't know if you're familiar with this. In Indonesia, we're not supposed to point using our index finger. So when you're showing someone to their seat, for example, when you're ushering someone to the seat, you either do this, or in the Javanese culture, you sometimes have to use their thumb. So using it, that's very valid. That's a very valid argument in Indonesia. We can't use our index finger to point someone to their seat, especially when there's a social, the status difference. So thank you very much for that answer.
It's very interesting. I think it's
yes,
societies also, you can just use one hand and not the other.
Yes, yeah. We can't use our left hand, only our right hand. Here.
I hope I wasn't too impolite in my presentation.
Oh no, not at all, not at all, not at all. I'm just sharing, and I'm actually trying to emphasize the point that you made, that even a pointing gesture, you said something about the lips. Some cultures point with their lips. In Indonesian, among Indonesians, sometimes we use this as well, but that's considered rather impolite. So this is the most polite way to do it. But I'm sure people in the Netherlands or in the US or in the UK would find this weird. What are you doing? But we're pointing someone to a specific direction. So yes, and I think this has already been answered. So I'm moving on to the next question. This next question is actually related to the question that you previously answered about the role of gestures in digital communication. And if I may summarize, you did mention that, of course, it's that different people have different preferences. Some lecturers or some professors don't really tolerate having emojis and emoticons in emails and texts. You, on the other hand, do not really mind. Mr. Sugiyadi was asking, what is the role and how to know gestures in digital communication? I think that did you want to add something else, or did the previous question already answer this question, you think?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, of course, digital communication can take different forms, like emails, text messages, Zoom calls, Skype calls, and so on. Yeah, in general, I would always, in any case, if you have the opportunity, try to also once in a while also make a hand gesture when you're communicating, because it maybe remind the person you're speaking with more of a face-to-face communication. Perhaps it's a bit more texting to interpret, but it might also have those benefits that there's more information. So if, for instance, in those kind of Zoom calls, if the auditory signal is not very stable and the visual signal is, perhaps you can make use of that by sending out more visual signals to have a bigger chance that the person you're communicating with understands you.
Right. And I think as lecturers, we all tend to do this like unconsciously, right? Even I don't like using virtual backgrounds. That's the reason why I don't like to use it, because sometimes my hands just go missing from the screen. But I make lots of hand gestures when I speak, especially when I'm lecturing. So yes, I think that was a very good, that was a very beneficial advice. So there's another question from Mila Irmawati related to the research of the use of demonstratives in several languages. Do you think the results will be similar or different across languages? Because there are unique demonstrative words. As you mentioned, some words have 6 demonstratives, others have only 2. And I actually noticed in the Malagasy demonstratives that you used, a lot of them are similar to us because we use ini, itu, sini, situ. So it's quite similar. It might be assumed that the use and the process of using the demonstratives might be dissimilar between monolinguals and bilinguals. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh yeah, very interesting. Yeah, there are definitely really big differences between languages in the number of terms. It's also sometimes hard to count them because in many languages there are also the basic forms, but then you can add all sorts of morphological elements to it to make them a bit more different again. One example is an Inuit language used by Inuits, And there they have typically very rich of those deictic demonstrative systems, as those are called. And there has been some fieldwork on this on a Inuit community and their demonstrative use, where there would be, if you look at the basic forms, there would be even already more than 10. And then if you would look at all the morphological elements they can add to it and make it, turn them into slightly different forms, to even more than 200. And then also those researchers wondered, why do they have so many different distinctions? And they identified things like they have one specific demonstrative term, for instance, for things that are on the other side of the river. And then there's a term for things that are on this side of the river. And there might also be in different communities, there are demonstrative forms specifically for things that are behind a mountain or that are in front of the mountain. Sometimes also more geographical notions are used. So things that are to your east may elicit one term, and things that are to your west may elicit a different term. Whereas, of course, in languages like English and Dutch, this simply doesn't happen. If you ask someone where is east, where is west, they simply do not know most of the time. So definitely in the kind of number of terms across languages, there are enormous differences. And then in the terms of the factors, the variables that affect which term somebody uses, there are again differences. Of course, this may be a big challenge for bilinguals then. So if you grow up with a language like English, where you have 2 terms, and then you start learning a language like Malagasy that has 6 or even more terms, yeah, you might really be wondering which term should I use in which situation. And it might really take, even though those words are very frequent and they are typically relatively short, so you might think they are relatively easy to learn. So the forms may be easy to learn, but pragmatically using those correctly in the appropriate context may take years of really getting to know, really implicitly finding out how people use those different terms. If you yourself never really realize where is east, where is west, that would be like a first step to constantly realize, oh, is this to the east of me or to the west? So although those terms I think are very ubiquitous, very much used, they may present like very big challenges for people who start learning a second language or a third language.
Still within the context of that same question, the same person, Mila, asked, do you think there are different brain areas are involved in bilinguals when they're processing the gestures, when they're using the first language as opposed to the second language? Like, for example, we're all bilinguals here, you're bilingual. When you're speaking Dutch, do your hand gestures, are they associated with the activity of a different brain area than when you're doing the hand gestures when you're using English, for example?
Yeah, another excellent question. Yeah, you could ask the same thing maybe as a starting point for different spoken languages, right? So one hypothetical situation could be there's your mother tongue, so the language that you know best from birth. Hypothetically, that could be located in one part of your brain, right? Whereas maybe if you learn a second language, it may be then use a different part of your brain. That could be one possibility, right? What research actually has shown, for instance, research using those fMRI methods like MRI scanners, somebody takes an MRI scan and then they're listening to words or they're reading words, or they even ask to produce words when they're in this scanner, and then looks at what kind of brain areas become active. There seems to be like really large overlap for different languages. So it's not the case that, for instance, all the words you know in one language are stored on the left part and the other words from another language stored on the right part. Typically, for instance, the lexical knowledge is all together in the temporal parts of your brain behind your ears. For gestures, a bit of the same thing seems to hold. So there again, there are no large differences in terms of like the gestural repertoire of one language would be in one place and the other repertoire would be in another place. It's typically the similar brain areas being employed for different tasks. So on the one hand, there's a sort of the memory component where you store your knowledge in one part of your brain for various languages together. And then when you're combining different signals as you see them, there might be a different region being employed for that. But again, relatively similar region, very close by for different languages. So in that sense, if you think of this more in terms of also perhaps a plasticity point of view, the brain then sort of reuses what it already sort of has as a basis. So if it's already used to using parts of your temporal lobe for storing information, it will do the same thing for a second language compared to for your first language. Yeah. It may shift between individuals, though. So there are cases of, for instance, blind individuals. They typically don't use parts of their brain that most of us use when we look at things. And then this
Yes.
part of the brain is reused for different things. So there might be between individuals with different backgrounds differences, but within individuals, it's typically very closely related between the first and the second language repertoire.
If I'm not mistaken, too, I think I read a research that said that it could be that there's a theory that the white matter of the same area. So, for example, the temporal lobe, that for comprehension of language, when you are multilingual, the white matter is thicker compared to other peoples who are monolingual, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know when I read this, and that this might have been like something that I read a long time ago, but.
Yeah, this also, I think, nicely relates to more practical consequences of multilingualism. So in several language communities, where there are both monolinguals and bilinguals, it turns out the case that bilinguals, if they at some point in their life get Alzheimer's, dementia, it's typically a number of years later compared to the monolinguals. So it seems to be the case that it's not the case that if you're bilingual, you will never get any dementia. But it seems to be the case that if you're bilingual and you use different languages throughout your life, this might happen later compared to monolinguals with sort of the same background.
So a delayed onset, it does have some benefit. All right.
And that also relates to this idea that there may be more connections in bilinguals between different parts of the brain, such that if you have sort of onset of dementia, if you're a bilingual or multilingual, there might be different connections already between different parts of, such that if one goes lost, it doesn't have any very serious detrimental consequences.
All right, because there are other areas to compensate for the degenerated ones. That's interesting.
Yeah, so there again, I think it's a nice example of a research topic that started out more curiosity-driven or fundamental research, that then at some point turns out to have some societal practical relevance as well.
All right, so thank you for your answer. I think we have one last question. This is from, I'm not going to mention who this is from, but it's actually a collective question. So I've, based on your curriculum vitae, so based on your CV, I've seen that you've done lots of research involving virtual reality, and I find that extremely interesting. I find that extremely interesting. Do you think you can share some of your, but briefly summarize, because we don't have a lot of time left. Can you briefly summarize your findings in gesture research using virtual reality techniques? And I think I also saw some use of neurophysiological measures and brain imaging techniques. If you can share some of that, that would be great before we close the session.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's true. I didn't talk about it today in the presentation. Yeah, so the basic idea is, if you think of the psychology studies, also the one that I was discussing, where people are placed in front of a computer screen and do a simple task. We build theories on the basis of those kind of paradigms. But in the end, we hope that our theories generalize to everyday situations, that we can sort of describe or explain what goes on in everyday situations. And of course, those simple lab tasks, placing people in front of a computer, is typically very artificial task, right? So it feels like we can never really be completely sure that what the theories we have and the findings we collect in the lab generalize to those much richer, dynamic, face-to-face situations. So therefore, at some point, there was this virtual reality technology becoming more and more developed. And this technology really allows you to still get people into a psychology lab, for instance, but then present them with a very rich environment. So for instance, they would wear a headset, and then if they look around, they're really in a 3D environment, and they can interact with certain virtual agents and avatars. And this allows us as researchers to recreate a very rich and dynamic situation in the lab. So on the one hand, we have a very rich situation that may resemble everyday situations, but at the same time, we still have control over what we show to participants, what's going on. And then at the same time, this can be combined with physiological and neurophysiological measures. So at the same time, sometimes we record people's brain activity, or we record their movements, still in a controlled environment, whereas in everyday life, it's much harder to measure people's brain activity when they're walking around or talking to each other. So that's the basic benefit. So what we're often doing in those kind of studies is that we take an existing finding or take a theory, and then test that theory in a much richer virtual environment to see whether we find the same thing, and to see whether those theories that we have also generalize if we don't test them in like a very static research lab environment, but in a more dynamic and rich situation where there's all sorts of information, people moving around. It's in 3D rather than in 2D. So that's the basic background. And so far, fortunately, I think most of the things that we test there are very much in line with what we found before in the lab. On the one hand, that's a very good thing. So the theories are being confirmed if we test them in more rich situations. On the other hand, then of course you can ask, well, do you then need this virtual reality because you find the same thing? And then my answer typically is, well, we still need it just to confirm, perhaps, and that the chances are high that those findings and theories that we have generalize to richer situations.
All right, thank you very much. Because personally, I'm not really familiar with lots of scientists that have done virtual reality within the context of like, I mean, I've heard of them studying post-traumatic stress disorders and like panic disorders, but it's not very often that we see it's. I think it's very impressive, and I think it's very innovative that you're doing virtual reality. Hopefully, one day soon, someone in our country will be able to do it too. So. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Peters, for the explanation. That was very insightful. I think let me just quickly summarize based on what I've heard from your explanation. So one of the first things that you mentioned is that people from different disciplines, from different educational backgrounds with different expertise would probably define language in different ways. It's not just students that define them varying ways, but people within the communications field, for example, would define it differently from psycholinguists, also different from business people, I guess, as well. And you also mentioned how in language, it's not enough to just focus on the spoken words, because after all, language is a multimodal expression. It's not enough to understand what we're trying to say, what someone is trying to say simply based on the spoken words alone. We also have to look at their gestures, their postures. So the nonverbal aspect of communication is as important as the verbal aspect. Sorry, I wrote them down. So it's important to study as well. So as far as what I've understood from your presentation is that the sender-receiver model, I think you mentioned, usually they just portray it as two heads, when it's in actuality, heads are not enough. You can't just determine what people are trying to say simply by observing the heads. You need you need a whole picture of the body to be able to comprehend thoroughly what the other person is trying to say. So it's important also to study both the mechanisms underlying not just speech comprehension, but also speech production. You said something about the conceptual framework of how to study this. And then you mentioned, as we've discussed in the question and answer as well, hand gestures, the role of hand gestures. There's emblem gestures. There's pointing gestures, which I personally find very interesting because I've always been intrigued in languages. Even I have a simple question like, how do interjections, the why do interjections vary from culture to culture? Like all Asian cultures use that's normal for Asians, but I don't think is common in the Western world. Don't you think? I don't think we do like it's very common for us, but not very common to you. So I find that personally very interesting. And lastly, you talked about the Mcgurk effect, which I found as well very interesting, because it would be interesting to see as well if the Mcgurk effect holds true not just for politicians, but also for us lecturers. If we emphasize, sometimes we do this too, like permit and permit, would that affect our students' understanding of what we're trying to say? So thank you very much. Hopefully my summary sort of summarized what you were trying to say. So once again, very insightful. I found it personally very interesting and intriguing. I might actually email you to ask you questions about language, about neurolinguistics. And now I think we're right on time. It's 5:45, and as scheduled, we're going to close this second cognitive neuroscience webinar series. But may I ask you, Dr. Peters, if you don't mind, don't leave the room just yet, because the MC is going to prompt us to take a group photo. Thank you very much. That was very, very insightful once again. Please don't leave yet. So back to you,
MC. For for the wonderful organization, also for the excellent question. It's really been a great pleasure to, in my case, end the morning on this note, and for you to end the afternoon on this
Yeah,
note.
it's actually evening for us right now. It's 5:45. Thank you so much. So MCs, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. David Peters, for the amazing sharing session. Also, thank you to Mrs. Manda for moderating this webinar. Not to forget the undergraduate program of the Faculty of Psychology, Universitas Indonesia. Thank you for arranging this webinar.
Yes, and before we end this session, it would be greatly appreciated if each and every one of us can turn on your cameras so that we can take a picture together as a group. So for the person in charge, please do direct us, Mika.
Okay, thank you, Shakira. Hello, everyone. I'm going to guide today's photo session. So if you can turn your camera on, I'm going to wait for 5 seconds. And since there are 7 pages, I'm going to take the picture 7 times. So please make sure you keep smiling during these 7 takes. Okay, so I'm going to start now. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And the last one, 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you. Back to Shakira.
Thank you, Mika, and thank you to all participants who have attended this webinar. We hope that this webinar gave you new insights that can help you really expand your horizons further. So with that being said, I am Shakira.
And I'm Deandra, representing all the committee members. Would like to apologize if we have said or did anything wrong throughout this webinar. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Peters. Good morning. Have a great rest of